Years after Gunsmoke ended, the cast began revealing what life was really like behind Dodge City's doors. For 20 years and 635 episodes, they became a family on and off camera. But Miss Kitty's story still held something fans didn't know. Keep watching, because the truth behind it took years to come out. For most of the people who grew up watching this show, the ending felt like a natural close to a long life. A Western that had run since the Eisenhower years finally reached its final sunset. The Marshal hung up his badge, and everyone rode off into TV history. That is the version that lives in memory. It is clean, it is tidy, and according to the people who actually stood on that set, it is almost completely wrong. When the surviving cast members began speaking openly about how the whole thing really ended, the picture they painted was not a graceful retirement. It was a door slammed shut without warning. The man at the center of it all was James Arness, who appeared in every single one of the 635 episodes as Marshal Matt Dillon. If anyone had earned the right to be told how his own show would end, it was him. Yet years later, Arness would explain in interviews that the cast and the producers had fully expected the series to continue. They believed another season was coming, maybe more than one. They had every reason to think so. What they did not know was that the decision to pull the plug had already been made in offices far away from the soundstage, and no one had bothered to pick up a phone. The way the news actually reached them is the detail that stops people cold. The cast did not hear it from a network executive. They did not get a meeting, a memo, or a courtesy call. Instead, members of the company learned that Gunsmoke had been canceled by reading about it in trade publications like The Hollywood Reporter. The same way a stranger flipping through a magazine would find out. 2 decades of loyalty, of building the longest-running Western in the history of American television, and the goodbye arrived in print alongside every other piece of industry gossip. To understand why that landed so hard, you have to understand what this show actually was. Gunsmoke was not just another Western in a decade crowded with them. It ran from 1955 to 1975 on television, and by the time it ended, it held the record as the longest-running Western series in United States television history, with 635 episodes. That is a number almost no scripted show reaches even today. For 20 straight years, this cast reported to the same fictional town, wore the same worn boots, and told stories about law and violence on the American frontier. But the story did not even begin on TV. Before it was ever filmed, Gunsmoke existed as a radio drama that ran from 1952 to 1961, and that radio version had a reputation for handling its subject matter with an honesty that set it apart. It treated the West as a hard, morally complicated place, rather than a playground of clean heroes and simple villains. That approach earned it a label that would define the entire franchise. People called it an adult Western, meaning it dealt with its themes more realistically and maturely than most of the competition, and that tone carried directly into the television series that followed. At the heart of it all stood a single character. The show centered on Marshal Matt Dillon, enforcing the law in Dodge City, Kansas, a lawman who carried the weight of an entire town on his shoulders. Around him gathered a small group of regulars who became the emotional spine of the series. There was the saloon owner, the town doctor, the loyal deputy figures who came and went across the years. And crucially, this ensemble did not just play a family on screen. By every account that later emerged, they functioned as a genuine one-off screen too. That family framing is not marketing language invented after the fact. It came from the people who ran the show. The producers and cast repeatedly described a set culture built on mutual respect and loyalty that outlasted almost every other production of its era. One of the show's producers said that the loyalty of the cast was a major reason the series became such a lasting success. This was not a group of actors who tolerated each other for a paycheck. They stayed together for 2 decades, which in the churn of network television is close to a miracle. And that is exactly what makes the manner of the ending sting. Here is where the cast's own revelations start opening doors that most fans never even knew existed. Because the abrupt cancellation was not the only thing the network handled strangely. It was not even the first time Gunsmoke had nearly been killed off. Years before the final axe fell, the show had faced a near cancellation that should have ended it early. And the way it survived that first scare involved a level of behind-the-scenes power and personal intervention. That sounds more like a corporate thriller than a Western. That story is coming, but it is not the strangest thing waiting in this history. Because before we get to boardrooms and ratings wars, there is a smaller, stranger admission that tells you exactly what kind of man was carrying this entire production. James Arness, the towering figure whose face defined the series, was famously almost pathologically private. He hated publicity so much that the number he was reportedly willing to pay to avoid it has become one of the most repeated facts about him. Arnis was said to have offered a publicist $20,000 a year if the person could guarantee him no publicity at all. Think about that. A leading man on the biggest Western on television, offering to pay money to stay out of the spotlight. That aversion earned him a nickname that stuck. Within the industry, this reluctant star became known as the Greta Garbo of Dodge City, a nod to the legendary actress who famously wanted to be left alone. It is a strange image, a man at the peak of fame doing everything in his power to disappear from view. But that single quirk hides a much deeper story about who Arnis really was, what he had survived before he ever sat on a horse in front of a camera, and why fame meant so little to him. That answer is buried deeper in this history, and it is worth the wait. For now, hold on to that image of the private giant, because the way he got the role in the first place is its own piece of Hollywood legend. The lead in Gunsmoke did not simply fall into his lap. It came to him through one of the most famous men in the history of the Western genre, a recommendation from a screen icon who was offered the part first and turned it down. That icon then went a step further, filming something for the show's debut that the cast themselves reportedly never saw until the night it aired. And what they saw surprised them. The icon was John Wayne. Wayne had been approached to play Matt Dillon himself, and he declined, but he did not walk away empty-handed. John Wayne recommended Arnis for the lead, an actor who was at the time under contract to Wayne's own production company. That connection alone would have been enough to make the casting a footnote of interest. But Wayne did something else, something generous and unusual that turned the premiere of Gunsmoke into a small event and gave the new star a blessing from the biggest name in the business. Wayne personally filmed an introduction for the premiere episode of Gunsmoke, stepping in front of the camera to hand the torch to the untested lead. It was an endorsement money could not buy. And the detail that makes it memorable is that the cast reportedly saw this introduction for the very first time when the show actually debuted. Right alongside the audience at home, they had not been shown it in advance. The man vouching for their whole enterprise appeared on their screens as a surprise, a gift unwrapped in real time. Getting to Arnis at all had been a long road for the producers. He was not the obvious or only choice. In fact, the search for the right Matt Dillon was exhaustive. 26 actors tested for the role of Matt Dillon before the part was finally settled. That is an enormous casting net, 26 men reading the same lines, trying to embody the same quiet, immovable lawman. Somewhere in that pile of screen tests was the future of the longest-running Western on TV, and it took a lot of searching to find him. One of the men passed over would go on to become a legend in his own right, and the reason he lost the part is telling. William Conrad, who had voiced Matt Dillon on the radio version, was passed over partly because the producers wanted a more conventionally heroic physical presence. Conrad had the voice. He had originated the character in the ears of millions of radio listeners. But television is a visual medium, and the people making the show wanted a certain kind of body on screen, a certain kind of towering figure. Conrad's voice had built Matt Dillon, and yet it was not enough to keep him in the role when the character moved to the screen. So the show launched with its reluctant giant, its John Wayne blessing, and its record-breaking ambitions intact. It climbed to the very top of the ratings and stayed there for years. It survived scares that should have killed it. It built a family that lasted 20 years. And then, at the end of all of it, that same family opened a trade magazine and discovered the whole thing was over. The cast had a great deal more to reveal about what those 2 decades actually cost them, and the biggest revelation of all had nothing to do with a cancellation. It had to do with a goodbye that came earlier and stayed hidden longer. One member of this family would leave before the end, worn down by years behind a bar and by a death that hit the set hard. And when she herself died years later, the official story handed to the public was not the truth. The real cause was kept quiet, then revealed 3 months after she was gone, and it made her one of the most talked about figures in the entire history of the show. That is where this story turns next, and it is the part fans still argue about today. Because for all the talk of a happy TV family, this one carried private wounds that never made it to air. The woman who ran the Long Branch Saloon, the beating heart of Dodge City's social world, had a story that ended in a way almost no one saw coming. What her friends knew, what her doctor eventually confirmed, and what the first headlines got completely wrong, together form the single most emotionally charged secret this cast ever kept. And unraveling it means starting with the moment she decided she could not do it anymore. There is a temptation, when a show is this beloved, to imagine that the people inside it lived charmed and simple lives. The truth of Gunsmoke is richer and harder than that. Each of the faces that filled Dodge City carried a private weight, and the show's calm surface was held up by people managing pain, ambition, and loss. The audience never glimpsed. The cast's later willingness to speak about all of it is what turned a nostalgic Western into one of the most quietly human stories in television history. And every thread of it starts unspooling from here. The woman behind the Long Branch Saloon was Amanda Blake, and for most of the show's life, she was as constant a presence as Arnis himself. She played Miss Kitty Russell, the owner of the Long Branch Saloon, for 19 seasons. That is 19 years of standing behind the same wooden bar, pouring the same drinks, delivering the same knowing looks to the same marshal. She was not a background figure. Miss Kitty was the emotional center of Dodge City's social world, the one person who seemed to understand Matt Dillon as a man rather than a badge. But the role that made her famous also became a kind of cage, and by the end, she said so plainly. When Blake finally walked away, she did not dress it up in gratitude and gentle nostalgia. She cited exhaustion and the sheer weight of the years as reasons for leaving after season 19. 2 decades is a long time to spend inside one character, and the physical location of that character made it worse. She had spent almost the entire run confined to one set, one position, one function in the story. The bar that made her an icon had also boxed her in. There was a second reason, and it was heavier than fatigue. Blake pointed to the death of a colleague as part of what pushed her toward the exit. Glenn Strange, who played Sam the bartender, died in 1973, and the impact of losing him was among the factors in Blake's decision to leave. Sam and Kitty had shared that saloon set for years. He was the quiet fixture at her side, the other half of the Long Branch's daily life. When he was gone, something about the place she reported to every day must have felt hollowed out. The set had lost one of its own, and for Blake that loss was part of what made staying impossible. What most people never realized is how hard she had fought to get the role in the first place. Miss Kitty was not handed to Amanda Blake as a sure thing. Blake actively fought for the part after another actress declined it. The role that would define her entire career, that would make her one of the most recognizable women on American TV for nearly 20 years, was something she had to chase. She saw something in Kitty that she wanted, and she went after it against the odds. That determination is part of what makes her later story so difficult to absorb. Because Amanda Blake was, by every account, a woman of strong will and fierce passions that extended far beyond acting. She was a devoted animal advocate, and she did not keep that passion at a polite distance from her work. She brought it directly onto the soundstage in ways that would be unthinkable on a modern set. In one of the most repeated stories about her, Blake brought pets onto the set, including a lion cub she named Chemo. A lion cub, on the set of a Western, carried in by the woman who ran the Long Branch. It is the kind of detail that tells you she lived exactly as boldly off camera as Miss Kitty seemed to on it. That boldness makes the way her life ended all the more wrenching, and all the more surrounded by confusion. Amanda Blake died in 1989, and when the news first broke, the public was given a cause that seemed to make sense given her history. She had been a heavy smoker, and she had previously been treated for oral cancer that was linked to that habit. So when initial public reports cited cancer as the cause of her death, it fit the narrative people already knew. It was a plausible, tragic, and unremarkable ending for a woman who had battled illness before. And it was not the full truth. The real cause emerged later, and it came from the one person with the authority to state it. Months after her death, her physician confirmed that Amanda Blake had actually died from AIDS-related complications. This was not speculation or rumor. It was her own doctor correcting the record on the cause of death of one of television's most beloved figures. The cancer story, the one that had comforted the public with its familiarity, had obscured something the culture of that moment was terrified to name. And the correction turned Blake's death into something far larger than the passing of an actress. The medical specifics her doctor described made the reality unmistakable. The complications that took her life were liver failure and CMV hepatitis, conditions tied to AIDS. These were the hallmarks of the disease. As it ravaged the immune system in that era, before effective treatments existed. For a public that had known Miss Kitty as a warm, untouchable presence for 19 years, learning that she had died this way collided violently with the image. The saloon owner from the safest, most comforting show on television had been claimed by the most feared illness of the decade. The question everyone immediately asked was how, and the answer that came from those close to her pointed in one direction. Friends and associates indicated that Blake likely contracted HIV from her fifth husband, who had himself died of an AIDS-related illness. Her final marriage, the short chapter that closed her personal life, appeared to be the source. The people who knew her did not present this as a scandal about her. They presented it as a tragedy that came to her, carried into her life by the man she had married. It reframed her death, not as a story about her choices, but about her misfortune. Those same friends were determined to protect her memory from the assumptions the diagnosis invited. In an era thick with judgment, they pushed back against the conclusions people were likely to draw. Those close to her stressed that she was not promiscuous and not a drug user, and pointed to her short final marriage as the explanation. This was a deliberate act of defense. They wanted the public to understand that the woman they knew did not fit the stereotype the disease carried in the public imagination. Her illness was not a verdict on her character. It was, in their telling, a cruel accident of a marriage that ended in loss. The timing of the whole revelation is part of what made it so significant. This was not a modern disclosure made in an age of understanding and treatment. Blake died at a moment when an AIDS diagnosis carried crushing stigma, when the disease was still widely misunderstood and feared, and when few public figures were openly associated with it. Her case stood out precisely because of that silence. She became one of the earlier high-profile actresses to be publicly associated with AIDS at a time of significant stigma. Her name entered a conversation the country was barely willing to have. That visibility gave her death a weight beyond her own life. Because she was so beloved, because Miss Kitty was such a fixture in living rooms across America, the confirmation of her cause of death forced a certain kind of reckoning. People who might have kept the AIDS crisis at an emotional distance suddenly had to connect it to a face they had trusted and adored for 19 years. The comfort of Dodge City and the terror of a real epidemic met in a single obituary. It is part of why her story remains one of the most discussed elements of the entire Gunsmoke legacy. And it explains why, decades later, the discussion around Amanda Blake still carries such a charge. When fans revisit the show today, her death is one of the topics they return to again and again. The gap between the first reports and the eventual truth, the role of her final husband, the stigma she died under. All of it keeps her story alive in a way that pure nostalgia never could. She was the woman who fought for a role another actress rejected, who carried a lion cub onto a Western set, who spent 19 years behind a bar she came to feel trapped by, and who died under a cloud of misinformation that took months to clear. Her exit from the show in season 19 and her death years later bracket a life lived with more intensity than the calm surface of Miss Kitty ever suggested. She left the Long Branch worn out and grieving. She left the world in a way that made headlines twice, once with a comforting lie and once with a difficult truth. And in doing so, she gave the show's history its most human and most heartbreaking chapter, the one that no amount of behind-the-scenes camaraderie could soften. The friends who defended her did so with a particular urgency, because they understood what the public would assume. In 1989, an AIDS diagnosis was not simply a medical fact. It carried an entire set of judgments about how a person must have lived. For a woman who had been welcomed into American living rooms for 19 years, as the wholesome, warm-hearted Kitty, those judgments threatened to rewrite her memory entirely. So the people who knew her spoke up not to sensationalize her death, but to guard the truth of her life against the cruel arithmetic of the moment. There is a particular pain in the fact that the comforting version came first. For 3 months after she died, the public mourned Amanda Blake, believing she had lost a battle with cancer, the same disease she had genuinely fought before. That version asked nothing difficult of anyone. It fit. And then it was corrected, and the correction demanded that people hold two things at once: their love for Miss Kitty and their fear of a disease the culture had turned into a moral verdict. That collision is exactly why her story became and remains the most emotionally charged secret this cast ever carried. But the sadness of how Amanda Blake left and how she died sits inside a much larger machine, and that machine is worth understanding on its own terms, because the show that gave her that stage did not simply appear fully formed. It was built deliberately and against considerable odds by people making hard choices about casting, about ratings, about survival. The Long Branch Saloon where she stood was one small piece of an enormous operation that fought for its life more than once. And the story of how Dodge City was actually constructed reveals a series of decisions that could easily have meant Amanda Blake never played Miss Kitty at all. To see that, we have to step back from the people and look at the apparatus around them. How this record-breaking series was cast, how it climbed to the absolute top of the ratings, how it was nearly killed years before its actual ending, and clawed its way back through an act of intervention that reached into the highest levels of the network. These are the mechanics behind the myth. And the first of those mechanics, the near-death experience that almost ended everything long before 1975, is one of the strangest survival stories in TV history. Before the family could form, before Amanda Blake could stand behind her bar or James Arness could ride down a single dusty street, someone had to decide who these people would be, and that decision was not made lightly. The casting of Gunsmoke was a genuine ordeal, a long and careful search for actors who could carry an adult western into a new medium. The center of that search, the role everything else depended on, was Matt Dillon, and the number of men who tried out for it tells you how seriously the producers took the choice they were making. The search for the Marshal was vast, and it left a lot of talented people on the cutting room floor. As the producers worked through their options, they moved past a man whose connection to the character ran deeper than anyone's. William Conrad had been the voice of Matt Dillon on the radio for years, the sound that millions of listeners had built the character around in their imaginations. But when it came time to put a face to that voice, the producers made a purely visual calculation. They wanted a different kind of presence on screen, a more conventionally heroic figure, and so the man who had defined Dillon in sound was left behind when Dillon learned to walk on camera. That choice, painful as it may have been for Conrad, set the template for everything that followed. The producers were building for TV specifically thinking about how a lawman should look towering over a saloon or filling a doorway. This was a show that would live or die on the physical believability of its lead. Every subsequent casting choice flowed from that same instinct, the search for people who felt real in the specific, weathered world of Dodge City. It was a philosophy that valued the truth of an image, and it would define the look of the series for the next 20 years. Once the show was cast and on the air, it did something almost no program manages. It did not just find an audience, it conquered its time slot and then the entire medium. Gunsmoke climbed to the very summit of American television and planted its flag there for a remarkably long stretch. The series ranked #1 in the Nielsen ratings for several seasons across the late 1950s and into the early 1960s. Not top 5, not a respectable hit, the single most watched show in the country, year after year, during the golden age of the Western. That dominance is the essential context for everything that came later, including the pain of the ending. This was not a marginal show clinging to life. It had been, for a meaningful period, the biggest thing on TV, the program the entire schedule was built around. When a show reaches that height, the people inside it develop a certain reasonable confidence that they matter, that they will be treated with a basic level of respect by the institution they built. That confidence is exactly what would make the later betrayals feel so sharp. A #1 show does not expect to be discarded. And yet, even at heights like that, Gunsmoke was not safe. This is the part of the history that surprises people most, because it runs against the assumption that a hit is a hit forever. In reality, the show came within a hair of cancellation years before its actual end, at a moment when the tides of television were turning against everything it represented. Around 1967, the series faced a near cancellation, driven partly by network executive preferences shifting away from rural and Western programming. The men making decisions were losing their appetite for cowboys and country towns. What saved it was not a groundswell of fan letters or a sudden rating spike. It was something far more personal, an intervention from the very top of the corporate structure that had nothing to do with the usual logic of television. The rescue was linked to CBS board figure William S. Paley and his wife's preference for the show. The taste of a powerful couple, the simple fact that they liked watching it, reached down into the schedule and pulled Gunsmoke back from the edge. A show watched by tens of millions was saved, in part because the right person in the right living room did not want to lose it. That rescue did not happen in a vacuum, and it came at a cost to other programs. When the network reshuffled its schedule to keep Gunsmoke alive, the shockwaves hit elsewhere. Among the shows affected by the reshuffle that saved the Western was a now legendary comedy. Gilligan's Island was among the programs caught up in the schedule changes. The castaways were pulled from the air in part because the Marshal was allowed to stay. It is one of those strange collisions of television history. Two beloved shows whose fates were tied together by a single scheduling decision, one saved and one sacrificed. So Gunsmoke survived its first brush with death and rolled on, its family intact, its place at the center of the schedule restored for the time being. And the reason that family held together through scares like this comes down to something the people who ran the show talked about openly. The loyalty on that set was real, and it was cited as a foundational reason the series endured. The atmosphere among the cast and crew was not the tense, transactional environment of many productions. It was something warmer, something that people compared to kinship. That closeness was described most memorably by the people in charge of the production itself. According to the accounts that later emerged, producer John Mantley and others described the regulars as a genuine family, bound by mutual respect that helped sustain the series for 2 decades. This was the glue. 20 years is long enough for resentment, ego, and boredom to tear most groups apart. What kept this one together was a bond that the producer himself framed in the language of family, a mutual regard that survived the grind of an endless production schedule. The evidence of that closeness showed up in the small human details of daily life on set, the kind of things that only happen among people who genuinely enjoy each other. The Gunsmoke set was a place of shared meals and running jokes, of a texture of ordinary companionship that filled the hours between takes. The regulars ate together, laughed together, and pulled pranks on one another with the ease of people who had spent years in each other's company. And some of those details, particularly around the food, have become small legends in their own right. The meals on that set were not props in the usual sense. The production went to unusual lengths to make the eating and drinking on screen feel authentic, which meant the cast was often consuming the real thing. The stories that survive describe real stew prepared for the cast, an authentic beer used on set for its foam. This was not colored water in the mugs at the Long Branch. When the cameras rolled on a scene of Dodge City life, the beer had real foam because it was real beer, and the food had real steam because someone had actually cooked it. At the center of many of those food stories was Arnis himself, whose appetite became part of the set's folklore. The private giant who paid to avoid publicity was, among his colleagues, a man who genuinely loved to eat, and the crew took note of it. Accounts of the set describe Arnis's large appetite as a memorable feature of the production, the towering star working his way through the real meals prepared for the cast. It is a warm, humanizing image, the reluctant celebrity finding simple pleasure in a bowl of stew between takes, entirely at ease among the people he trusted. That ease is the through line of the entire set culture, and it is backed up by an absence as much as a presence. In the standard histories of the show, across 20 years and an enormous rotating cast, there is a conspicuous lack of the kind of drama that plagues most long-running productions. No major public feuds among the core group are recorded. The pranks were friendly, the meals were shared, and the disagreements, whatever they were, stayed private and small. For a show that ran 2 decades, that record of harmony is genuinely unusual, and it is a large part of why the family framing has held up. The authenticity of the food was not just a quirk. It reflected a whole philosophy about how this show should feel. A production that used real beer for real foam and cooked real stew for its cast was a production that cared about the texture of its world being true. That same care extended to the way the people on set treated one another. The realness of the meals and the realness of the bonds were of a piece, both flowing from a place that valued substance over shortcut, and both feeding the sense that Dodge City was a genuine place inhabited by genuine people. It is worth sitting with how rare that harmony truly was, because television history is littered with the opposite. Long-running shows are notorious for breeding resentment, for turning colleagues into rivals, for producing feuds that spill into the press and poison the work. Gunsmoke ran longer than almost any of them, with a cast that rotated and expanded across 20 years, and it left behind no significant record of that kind of poison among its core. That absence is itself a kind of evidence, a quiet testament to the loyalty the producers kept describing. But harmony on that scale is never accidental, and it never comes from nothing. The loyalty that producer Mantley described, the ease that Arnis felt at that table, the willingness of these people to stay together for 20 years, all of it grew out of the individual histories that each of them carried onto that set. The men and women of Dodge City were not blank slates who happened to get along. They were people shaped by war, by ambition, by injury, and by choices that nearly sent their careers in completely different directions. And nowhere is that truer than with the private giant at the center of it all. The story of why James Arness cared so little for fame, why he could pay to disappear and still command a soundstage, why he limped through certain scenes and masked it with such discipline, reaches back to a battlefield thousands of miles from Hollywood. The men behind the marshal each carried something the audience never saw. What Arness carried was the heaviest of all, and it explains nearly everything about the quiet, immovable presence that anchored the longest Western in TV history. To understand James Arness, you have to start with his body, because everything about his screen presence began there. He was an enormous man by any standard, and that physical scale was central to why he was cast over a voice as established as William Conrad's. Arness stood 6 feet 7 inches tall, a genuine giant in an era when leading men were often much smaller. When he filled a doorway in Dodge City or towered over a cornered outlaw, none of it was camera trickery. The sheer size of the man was real, and it gave Matt Dillon a physical authority that no amount of acting could manufacture. But that towering frame concealed a wound, and the story of that wound is the key to the entire man. Long before he ever put on a marshal's badge, Arness had gone to war, and the war had nearly destroyed his ability to walk at all. He was a World War II veteran, and during the fighting he suffered a catastrophic injury to his leg. Specifically, his right leg was severely wounded, shattered by machine gun fire at Anzio. Anzio was one of the brutal Italian beachheads of the war, a place of ferocious combat, and it was there that the future Matt Dillon's leg was torn apart by enemy fire. His service and his sacrifice were formally recognized, marking him as a genuine combat casualty rather than a Hollywood invention of one. For what he endured and what he did, Arness was awarded the Purple Heart and the Bronze Star. The Purple Heart for the wounds he took, the Bronze Star for his conduct under fire. These were not decorations handed out lightly. They marked him as a man who had bled for his country and acquitted himself with distinction in the process. And he carried the physical consequences of that service for the rest of his life. Those consequences did not fade when the war ended. The injury left a permanent mark on how Arness moved, and he spent his entire television career managing it. He lived with chronic pain and a real limp, the lingering result of the Anzio wound, for the full 20 years he played Matt Dillon. Consider what that meant in practice. The role demanded years of horseback riding, of walking down streets, of physical confrontation and action, all performed on a leg that had been shattered by a machine gun and never fully healed. Every day on that set was in some quiet way a day of managed pain. And here is the discipline that defined him. Despite that constant pain, Arness largely masked the limp on camera, working around it with such skill that most of the audience never suspected a thing. The man who strode so confidently through Dodge City was doing so on a ruined leg, hiding the evidence through sheer professional will. For 2 decades, he performed physical scenes that would have been demanding for an uninjured man, and he did it while concealing the wound underneath. That is the private cost that never appeared on screen. The war carried quietly beneath the marshal's easy authority. Now, the pieces of that publicity aversion from the very beginning of this story fall into place. A man who had seen the reality of Anzio, who had bled on a beachhead and earned a Purple Heart, was never going to be impressed by the machinery of celebrity. Fame, to a man who had survived that, was a small and slightly absurd thing. His willingness to pay to avoid the spotlight, his retreat from publicity, his contentment among the small circle of people he trusted on set, all of it flows from a man whose sense of what mattered had been forged somewhere far more serious than a soundstage. The giant who paid to disappear had already faced the only spotlight that ever truly tested him. Yet the same serious man had a lighter side that his colleagues knew well, and it took the form of pranks. The private, pain-managing veteran was also on set a mischief maker who enjoyed catching his fellow actors off guard. The accounts of his behind-the-scenes behavior describe a man who liked hiding and startling guest actors, lying in wait to spook someone new to the set. It is a wonderful contradiction. The towering war hero with the ruined leg and the aversion to fame, crouching somewhere out of sight to jump out and startle a nervous guest star. It reveals the warmth underneath the reserve. Arness was not the only man in Dodge City hiding something remarkable, and the actor beside him for the early years invented one of the most famous physical characterizations in Western television out of nothing. Dennis Weaver played Chester Good, the marshal's deputy, and Chester's defining trait, his distinctive limp, was entirely Weaver's creation. He built the character's walk himself, and he did it deliberately as a piece of acting. The limp that made Chester iconic was invented by Weaver after an initial audition, a choice that gave the character an instant, unforgettable identity. The accent was his invention too, drawn from a real person out of his own past. Chester's voice, that particular rural cadence that fans remember, did not come from a script or a dialect coach. Weaver built it by imitating a school acquaintance, reaching back into his own memory for a way of speaking that would make Chester feel real and specific. Between the invented limp and the borrowed accent, Weaver constructed an entire human being from pieces he found himself, and the result was one of the most beloved supporting characters of the show's early years. But the very choice that made Chester iconic came back to haunt Weaver, both physically and emotionally. That invented limp was demanding to perform day after day, and it took a real toll on him. The limp was physically taxing, and Weaver later expressed regret when fans, worried by the sight of it, became concerned about his actual health. His acting had been so convincing that people believed he was genuinely injured, and their worry troubled him. He had created something so real that it blurred the line between performance and truth, and living inside that performance wore on his body. In the end, Weaver made a decision that many actors in a hit show never dare to make. He walked away at the height of the character's popularity, and he did it for a specific, career-minded reason. Weaver left the show after 9 seasons to avoid being typecast, unwilling to spend his whole career trapped as Chester Good. It was a bold move, leaving a secure role on the biggest Western on TV. But he understood the danger of becoming a single character forever, and he chose to protect his range as an actor over the comfort of a guaranteed job. And on his way out, he made a point of crediting the man at the top. For all the friendly distance of his private nature, Arness had been a source of early support for Weaver, and Weaver acknowledged it. He credited Arness with early support as he reflected on his time in Dodge City. The giant marshal had helped the man who invented Chester's walk, another small piece of evidence for the loyalty that the producers kept describing. The family framing was not just about the ones who stayed. Even a man leaving to protect his own career left with gratitude for the star who had helped him early on. While Weaver was inventing Chester, another actor was building a very different kind of long-term presence, and his relationship with Arness followed a fascinating arc. Milburn Stone played Doc Adams, the town physician, and he was nearly as constant a presence on the show as Arness himself, staying with it for almost the entire run. But his bond with the star did not begin as friendship. In fact, the two men started out at odds. There was early friction between Stone and Arness over matters of professionalism, a tension between two serious men figuring out how to share a set. What happened to that friction is the heart of the Gunsmoke family story. It did not fester into a feud, it transformed. Over the years, the early tension between Stone and Arness turned into deep mutual respect and a friendship that was later described in brotherly terms. The two men who had bristled at each other early on became, in effect, brothers, bound by years of shared work and mutual regard. It is the perfect illustration of what made the set work. Even the conflicts resolved into loyalty, the rough edges worn smooth by 2 decades of standing side by side. Stone took his role seriously enough that he let real medicine shape it, responding to feedback from actual professionals. When real doctors wrote in with corrections about medical inaccuracies in the show, Stone paid attention. He took his personal research seriously after real doctors wrote in about medical inaccuracies, and he even helped shape the invented backstory of Doc Adams himself. He was not content to simply recite lines about medicine. He wanted the character to hold up, to feel credible to the people who actually practice the profession, and he built Doc into someone real through that care. His dedication was tested by his own body during the run, when his health forced a rare absence from the show. Stone, so constant across the years, had to step away for a serious medical reason of his own. He missed a handful of episodes due to heart surgery, a genuine health crisis that briefly pulled Doc Adams from Dodge City. It is another reminder that the durability of this cast was hard-won, that behind the seamless continuity of the show were real people facing real physical trials, from Arness's shattered leg to Stone's failing heart. Beyond the individual men, there was one relationship the show handled with a deliberation that still fascinates fans, and it involved the marshal and the saloon owner. The bond between Matt Dillon and Miss Kitty was one of the most talked about elements of the series, a slow-burning connection that audiences watched for 2 decades. and the show made a very specific, very intentional choice about it. It was kept as deep mutual care and attraction, but never formalized into an on-screen marriage or explicit romance. The tension was the point, and resolving it would have broken something essential. The reason was structural, tied to the very premise of the show. Matt Dillon was the solitary, duty-bound lawman, a man whose isolation was part of who he was. To marry him off would have changed the entire nature of the series. Arness himself confirmed the thinking behind it, explaining that the characters loved each other, but formalizing that love would have required a completely different series. The love was real within the story. It simply could never be allowed to resolve, because the show depended on Matt Dillon remaining the lonely marshal, married to nothing but his duty. There was another layer to Miss Kitty that the TV show handled with deliberate vagueness, and it reached back to the character's radio origins. On the radio version, Kitty's background was far more explicit than anything television would show. The character was, on radio, more explicitly presented as a prostitute or madam, a background that TV largely toned down. The TV series left it implied at most, allowing viewers to read into Kitty's history what they wished, while never stating it outright. It is one of the enduring debates among fans. The question of exactly what Miss Kitty's past was meant to be, a question the show itself intentionally never answered. The world around these central figures was populated by a rotating cast of characters and future legends that gave the show remarkable depth over its 20 years. After Weaver left, Ken Curtis took over deputy duties as the character Festus Hagen, and other regulars cycled through, including Burt Reynolds as Quint Asper, Roger Ewing as Thad Greenwood, and Buck Taylor as Newly O'Brien. The show became a kind of way station for talent, a place where established actors worked and future stars passed through. Its longevity meant that an extraordinary number of people moved through Dodge City across those 2 decades. That volume of guest talent produced one of the show's most remarkable and least known legacies, a guest star roster that reads like a Hall of Fame of American entertainment. Over the years, the people who appeared on Gunsmoke included a staggering list of future icons. The guest stars across the run included future icons such as William Shatner, Leonard Nimoy, Harrison Ford, Jodie Foster, and Kurt Russell, along with members of the original Star Trek and Brady Bunch casts. Before they were legends, before Star Trek and Star Wars and everything else, they passed through Dodge City. The show was so long-lived and so central that it caught the whole future of Hollywood on its way up. All of these people, the war hero marshal, the inventive deputy, the brotherly doctor, the fought-for saloon owner, the parade of future stars built something that felt permanent. And that sense of permanence is exactly what makes the final chapter so poignant, because permanence is an illusion. And one by one, the people who built Dodge City would leave it for the last time. The family that stayed together for 20 years could not stay together forever, and the story of how that family finally dispersed, of who left first and who remained at the very end, brings this whole history to its close. Before the family began to scatter for good, there was one more act to play, and almost nobody expected it. The cameras had gone cold in 1975, the sets had been struck, and for a long stretch it seemed the marshal had ridden off for the final time. Then, years later, Dodge City was summoned back to life. The demand for these characters had never really died, and the industry answered it in a way that put the old lead back in the saddle one more time, long after most people assumed that door had closed forever. What followed was a small revival that stretched across 2 decades of afterlife. In the late 1980s and into the 1990s, a run of 5 made-for-television Gunsmoke films followed the original series, with James Arness returning to the role of Matt Dillon. 5 separate times, the private giant strapped the badge back on and walked into Dodge City again, older now, grayer, but unmistakably the same immovable lawman audiences had trusted for 20 years. The man who had once paid to disappear kept coming back to the one role that would never let him go. There is something quietly moving in that return, and it says a great deal about the man and the audience alike. Arness did not need the work in the way a struggling actor might. He came back because the character meant something, because the demand was real, and because Matt Dillon had become less a role than a responsibility he carried. Each film was a reunion with a version of himself the country refused to forget, and each one proved that the abrupt, unceremonious ending in 1975 had never actually severed the bond between this man and the town he had policed for 2 decades. The Those films are the bridge between the living show and the long goodbye that followed. Because once the revival ran its course, time began doing what time does. The people who had built Dodge City were aging, and one by one they reached the end of their roads. The dispersal of the Gunsmoke family did not happen all at once. It unfolded slowly across more than 40 years, each loss arriving like a separate toll of a bell, each one taking a little more of the original world with it into memory. It began with the Doctor, and it began early. Milburn Stone, the man who had once clashed with Arnis over professionalism before becoming his brother in all but blood, who had researched real medicine to make Doc Adams credible, and had survived his own heart surgery during the run, was the first of the central figures to go. Stone died in 1980, only 5 years after the series ended. The brotherly bond that had anchored the set lost one of its two great pillars, and the long, slow farewell had officially begun. Losing Stone so soon after the show closed carried its own particular sting. He had been there almost from the beginning and stayed nearly to the end, a fixture as reliable as the Marshal himself. For fans, his death meant that Doc Adams, the wry and dependable healer of Dodge City, was gone from the world barely half a decade after he had last appeared on their screens. The town was still fresh in everyone's memory, still airing in reruns, and yet one of its cornerstones was already lost. It was the first sign that the family so durable on screen was mortal after all. The losses continued through the following decade, and they touched the woman who had ruled the Long Branch. Amanda Blake's death in 1989 fell within this same stretch of years, her passing landing in the middle of the family's slow dissolution and becoming, for reasons already explored, the most talked about of them all. But her name belongs here too simply as a marker on the timeline. Another light going out in the steady dimming of Dodge City, another member of the ensemble gone before the decade was through. Then came the man who had inherited the deputy's role and made it entirely his own. Ken Curtis had stepped into the space Dennis Weaver left behind, and as Festus Hagen, he built one of the most beloved characters in the show's entire history, a scruffy, loyal, unforgettable presence who carried the later years of the series. His death closed one of the warmest chapters of the whole production. Curtis died in 1991, and with him went another of the faces that had made Dodge City feel like a real and populated place. Curtis had been part of what kept the show alive through its middle and later seasons, the comic and human heart that balanced the Marshal's stern authority. When he died, the town lost one of its most distinctive voices, a character actor who had turned a supporting part into something audiences genuinely loved. His passing in the early 1990s meant that two of the four most constant presences from the classic run, the Doctor and the second deputy, were now gone within just over a decade of the finale. The family was thinning fast. The man who had originated the deputy role in the first place lasted far longer, carrying his piece of the legacy well into the new century. Dennis Weaver, who had built the unforgettable Chester Good out of an invented accent and a self-created limp, and who had famously walked away after 9 seasons to protect his career from typecasting, lived a long and full life beyond Dodge City. Weaver died in 2006, decades after his celebrated exit from the show that first made his name. Weaver's longevity gave his story a different shape than the others. He had left early, by choice, and in doing so, he had built a career and a life that reached far past the borders of Dodge City. By the time he died, he had outlived many of the castmates he once shared the screen with, a survivor of the early years who watched from a distance as the rest of the family slowly departed. The deputy who had worried fans with a limp so convincing they feared for his health had, in the end, walked a longer road than almost anyone from those first seasons. And then came the loss that mattered most of all, the departure of the giant who had been the constant of the entire enterprise. James Arnis, who had appeared in every one of the 635 episodes, who had returned 5 more times for the revival films, who had carried the show on his shoulders for 20 years and then some, finally reached the end of his own long trail. Arnis died in 2011. The Marshal was gone. His death was the one that truly signaled the end of an era, because Arnis had been Gunsmoke in a way no one else could claim. He was the only face present in every single episode, the spine of the whole thing, the man John Wayne himself had once vouched for on the night the show began. When he died, the last direct line to that premiere night, to the very origin of the series, was severed. The towering presence that had defined the American television western for a generation had ridden out of Dodge City for the final time, and this time there would be no revival to bring him back. Even after the Marshal was gone, the extended family lingered, and their losses kept marking the passing years. Burt Reynolds, who had played the blacksmith Quint Asper in his early days before rocketing to global superstardom, carried his small piece of Gunsmoke history with him through one of the most famous careers in Hollywood. His time in Dodge City had been an early rung on an extraordinary ladder, a footnote to a life that became legend. Reynolds died in 2018, and his passing quietly closed another link between the old Western and the wider world of American movie stardom. Reynolds represented something unique among the show's alumni, a man who had used Dodge City as a launching pad and then soared far beyond it. For most of the world, he was a movie icon first and a Gunsmoke player almost not at all. Yet the connection was real, and his death reminded fans that this show had been a crossroads, a place where a future superstar had once done honest supporting work before the world knew his name. When he died, one of the most glamorous threads connecting Gunsmoke to the larger story of Hollywood was cut. The most recent loss came at the very close of 2025, and it narrowed the circle of survivors down almost to nothing. Roger Ewing, who had played Thad Greenwood among the show's rotating regulars in the mid-1960s, had held on far longer than most of his castmates, a quiet survivor from the middle years of the run. But time spares no one, and his passing broke one of the last remaining links to the original production. Ewing died in December 2025, and his death left the Gunsmoke family smaller than it had ever been. The timing of Ewing's death carried a strange poignancy, because it arrived just as the show was enjoying a fresh surge of public affection. While a new generation was discovering Dodge City and older fans were revisiting it, one of the men who had actually walked those streets slipped away. His passing at the end of 2025 meant that the roster of living regulars, once a crowded and vibrant company of actors, had dwindled to a single name. The dispersal that began with Stone in 1980 had, across 45 years, run almost to completion, which brings the whole long story to the one man who remains, the last principal figure still standing from the world of Dodge City. Of all the regulars who filled that town across 2 decades, of all the deputies and doctors and saloon keepers and townsfolk, exactly one is still here. As of 2026, Buck Taylor remains the principal surviving regular cast member of Gunsmoke. The man who played the gentle, capable Newly O'Brien has outlasted them all. The marshal and the doctor, and the saloon owner and every other familiar face. There is a weight to being the last one, a quiet duty that falls on the final survivor of any great shared endeavor. Buck Taylor now carries the living memory of Gunsmoke almost alone, the sole remaining witness among the principal regulars to what it was actually like inside that town, on that set among that family. Every story of the pranks and the shared meals and the loyalty, every first-hand memory of the giant who anchored the show, now runs through him. He is the keeper of a world that exists nowhere else but in reruns and in the recollections of the very few who lived it. And Taylor has worn that role with remarkable grace, refusing to become merely a relic of a bygone show. Far from fading into quiet retirement, he has stayed genuinely, vigorously active, building a life that has carried him to audiences who were not even born when Gunsmoke ended. He continues to work as an actor, including a role on the modern Western hit Yellowstone, and has also built a respected career as a Western artist. The last man standing from the golden age of the TV Western found his way onto the defining Western drama of the current age. There is a beautiful symmetry in that path, the way it links the greatest Western of one century to one of the biggest of the next. The final survivor of Dodge City did not simply reminisce about the old days. He picked up his craft and walked straight into the modern revival of the very genre he helped define, appearing on a show watched by millions who may know nothing of Matt Dillon. And when he is not acting, he paints the West with his own hands, translating the landscape and the mythology he lived inside into art. He does not just remember the frontier, he keeps making it. But this long roll call of loss holds one more private tragedy, the heaviest of all the personal costs this cast ever carried, and it belonged to the man at the very center of everything. Behind the public deaths of aging actors lay a wound in the life of the show's star that had nothing to do with career, illness, or age. James Arness, who had already endured more physical suffering than his audience ever suspected, was made to endure something no parent should. Among the private griefs that shadowed the cast was the suicide of Arness's daughter. That single fact reframes the entire image of the reluctant, publicity-shunning star one final and definitive time. The reserve, the retreat from the spotlight, the strange willingness to pay money simply to be left alone, the contentment he found only within the small trusted circle of the set, all of it takes on a deeper and sadder meaning in light of a loss like that. This was a man who understood grief in its most devastating form, who carried a private darkness through the very years he was projecting calm authority across the nation's living rooms every single week. The distance he kept from the machinery of fame was never coldness, and it was never simple shyness. It was the armor of a man who had known real loss in its most brutal shapes, first on a battlefield far from home and later within his own family. Against sorrows of that magnitude, the noise and glitter of celebrity must have seemed not just unimportant, but almost obscene. The quiet loyalty of his castmates, the ordinary comfort of a shared meal, the simple work of showing up and doing the job well. Those were the things that held real value for a man who had learned exactly how much can be taken away. It is worth pausing on how completely that private suffering was hidden from view, because it speaks to the entire ethos of this cast. The audience that adored Matt Dillon for 20 years had no idea of the burdens the man playing him carried off-screen. The masked limp, the chronic pain, the family tragedy, all of it stayed behind the scenes, concealed by the same professional discipline that let him stride so confidently through Dodge City on a ruined leg. He gave the public the marshal and kept the grief for himself, and he did it for decades without complaint. That instinct toward privacy, toward carrying one's weight quietly, seems to have run through the whole company, and it is a large part of why the show's real story took so long to fully emerge. These were not people who traded on their pain or aired their sorrows for attention. They did the work, protected one another, and kept the difficult truths of their lives away from the cameras and the columns. The polished, comforting world they built on screen was held up day after day by people privately bearing things they never asked the audience to share. Today, the show these people made lives on, carried forward by nostalgia and by the simple fact that it never left the air. Gunsmoke has proven remarkably resistant to being forgotten, finding fresh life in rerun for generation after generation of viewers who were not even alive during its original run. The series continues to air in syndication, including on the nostalgia-focused network MeTV, introducing Dodge City to audiences who discover it decades after the last new episode aired. The marshal still rides every day for anyone willing to tune in. That continuous presence is part of why the show has never quite faded into history the way most of its contemporaries have. While countless westerns of its era vanished from memory, Gunsmoke kept playing, kept finding new eyes, kept renewing its claim on the culture one rerun at a time. A child flipping channels today can still stumble onto Dodge City, still meet Matt Dillon and Doc Adams, and Miss Kitty as if no time had passed at all. The town endures in a kind of permanent present, always airing somewhere, always available to be discovered fresh. That enduring presence has, in recent years, fueled a genuine wave of renewed fascination, a flood of content revisiting the show's history and its secrets. Across 2024 through 2026, the internet filled with retrospectives digging into every corner of the production's past. This surge produced an endless stream of articles and video content revisiting the things fans did not know, from rare photographs of the cast's real-life camaraderie to the details of the abrupt cancellation and the private histories of the stars. The old show became new content, mined again and again for its behind-the-scenes stories. It is that very wave of rediscovery that gathered all these scattered facts into one place. That took the war injury and the animal advocate and the invented limp and the abrupt goodbye and packaged them together for modern audiences, hungry for the story behind the story. The renewed attention did not just celebrate Gunsmoke. It excavated it, pulling the human details out of old interviews and obituaries, and set memories and presenting them to viewers who had only ever known the polished surface. This is the machinery that turns a decades-old Western into a fresh sensation, and it is why these secrets are being told and retold now. And that is precisely where honesty demands a reckoning with the promise this whole story was built on. Because titles that promise buried scandal, hidden shame, some dark truth lurking beneath the wholesome surface of Dodge City are making a promise of a very particular kind. That framing is, in the end, a piece of careful packaging. It functions as classic clickbait presentation for an accumulated set of behind-the-scenes details. Engineered to make ordinary history feel like forbidden revelation, the promise of a shocking secret is the hook. It is not. It turns out, the substance, because when you actually gather everything the cast revealed, everything the record documents, the truth runs in the exact opposite direction of scandal. What most fans never figured out is not that Dodge City concealed something ugly beneath its wholesome face. It is that the wholesomeness was, to a remarkable degree, entirely real. The loyalty the producers described was not a publicity fiction. It was genuine, sustained, and documented across 2 full decades of shared work, confirmed again and again by the people who actually lived it rather than manufactured after the fact by a marketing department. The real revelations, the ones that actually matter, were never scandals at all. They were private costs, borne with quiet dignity by people who never asked for sympathy. There was the shattered leg and the 2 decades of masked pain. There was the daughter lost to tragedy. There was the beloved actress whose death was first misreported and then corrected under a cloud of stigma. There was the deputy who regretted a performance so convincing it frightened the fans who loved him, and the doctor whose own heart nearly failed him mid-run. These are not the sordid secrets that clickbait promises. They are the human truths of real people. There was also threaded through everything, a deep and deliberate restraint in how this show was made. A discipline that reveals more about its integrity than any scandal ever could. The care taken with the world, right down to the real food and the real friendships. The refusal to cheapen the central relationship for an easy payoff. The quiet protection the cast extended to one another and to their own private pain. All of it points to the same thing. This was a production built by people who valued substance over spectacle, both in the stories they told and in the way they treated each other while telling them. So the thing fans never figured out, the real revelation waiting at the end of all this, is not a trick or a betrayal or a hidden rot beneath the floorboards of Dodge City. It is something far more surprising in an age that expects every beloved thing to eventually disappoint. There was a group of people who genuinely respected one another, who respected the work they did together, and who paid quiet, private prices out of view of the audience in order to give that audience something that felt, for 20 unbroken years, like home. That is the secret. It was never a lie dressed up as comfort. It was the truth, hiding in plain sight the entire time.